special things that has happened just in the last 2 or 3 years is an opportunity to recognize some of the women who began programs here. And when you talk about them, I thought about this today, when you call them pioneers, what they faced in terms of what they had to deal with, budgets, facilities, all that sort of thing, was kind of like the pioneers coming out here in covered wagons to settle this country in perspective to the easeability. And so, and unfortunately, there was very little in the archives or media guides or anything else about that history. So through the help of the public, people that were involved in those days, a lot of this has come to our attention. Natasha, would you stand for just a moment? Natasha Fife was inducted into our Hall of Fame 2 years ago, kind of got it rolling. And our next presenter is someone who was a student athlete in those very early days of Wichita State women's athletics, was a volleyball player who has gone on to become a nationally recognized and honored college volleyball official at the highest levels. She continues to serve as an evaluator of officials, and beyond that, just with her experience, her outgoing personality, she is a great ambassador for volleyball, for women's sports, and for her university. So it's a pleasure to welcome Marcia Alterman.
Thanks, Mike. That was very nice. And congratulations as well to all the inductees today. I was so honored when Janet asked me to introduce her today. And as I kind of tried to collect my thoughts to give you all some feel for what it was, the challenges of women's athletics back in the early days, the 70s, and try to come up with a memorable story or two about Janet and our teams of the day, this one resounding thought kept going through my head, and that thought was, it's about damn time, okay? When we were 19, 20, 21, we were all just infatuated with this new opportunity to compete and to represent our university. And Janet was kind of the ringleader of our group. She was a gifted athlete, especially considering that none of the women athletes back in the early 70s had the benefit of organized youth sports or professional coaching, forgive me, Natasha, or or even basic fitness training. Janet's talent was natural. It was somewhat raw, but she was an intense competitor. As a teammate, she was a role model for practicing hard and competing even harder. And she encouraged her teammates. She sometimes yelled at us, to be quite honest. She often laughed with us because you had to in those days. But she simply loved competition, demonstrated by the fact that she competed in every team sport available at Wichita State at the time. She was a four-sport athlete for her entire college career. So that would include field hockey, volleyball, basketball, and softball. They all had overlapping seasons. She was constantly in one sports season or another while she was a student. I played 4 years of volleyball at Wichita State in the early 70s, 3 of them with Janet as a teammate. And I owe that start and my continued involvement in the sport for the next 50 years to her. In my first fall semester, as a freshman at Wichita State, I was sitting in the Majors Lounge up in Henry and Gymnasium one afternoon, probably studying because I did that a lot. And Janet came up and said, "Come on, it's time for volleyball practice." Now, I'd never played a game of organized volleyball in my life. And I came to Wichita State hoping to play basketball and softball because I thought I knew something about those sports. So when I replied to Janet, "Hey, I don't play volleyball," she said, "Well, you do now because we don't have 12 people to scrimmage." I was no dummy, and I had learned already in my first few weeks as a freshman that you simply don't argue with Janet. So I became a volleyball player, and I've never regretted that decision, trust me. We had a pretty tight clique of athletes in those days, evidenced by the number of people that are here in support. We practiced and we played together. We sometimes shared apartments. We took classes together. We studied together. We socialized together. And Janet was a leader through all of those rites of passage that you go through in college. She stayed sober when some of us didn't. She took charge of trips and drove her car to not only matches and games, but activities, let's say. She'll tell you about a couple of those. And she even sometimes made going to her folks' farm to do things like toss hay bales or castrate lambs seem like fun. She was quite the team builder, trust me. Stats, as Mike mentioned, weren't kept for women's athletics back in the beginning, and what stats we had for those teams has been lost. But anecdotally, I can assure you that Janet was an all-star kind of athlete. She made more all-tournament and all-star teams than I can count. We had several talented women on our teams in those days, but Janet stood out both as a performer and a team leader. When Title IX came along in about 1974 and kicked open the door for Wichita State to actually hire coaches for their women's teams, it made sense for Janet to be one of the first. So after competing at a high level for 4 years as a student athlete, she came back to coach 3 sports. Without a blueprint, because there was no role model, there was no blueprint in those days, and without the support of assistants or trainers or managers or directors of ops, she simply figured it out. She took the first baby steps of recruiting and scholarships and compliance, and she helped build the foundation for the successful Wichita State women's sports programs of today. She was a true pioneer. So she's been a shocker in probably more ways than virtually any Wichita State student athlete before or since. So I say again, it's about damn time. I proudly introduce a true Hall of Famer who's been a role model, a mentor, and a dear friend for 50 years, Janet Hoskins.
Well, I didn't come over on a covered wagon, Marcia. I'm not that old. But thank you for the introduction, Marsh. I would like to thank the Hall of Fame Committee, Sergio Roman, the rest of you back there, Terry Moses, Mike Kennedy. Congratulations to the other recipients, and Luciana on your amazing accomplishments. You have a list a mile long, I think. Tanya, Greer, Jamar, thank you for sharing today with me. I need to mention one thing, that Marcia was my roommate and my assistant coach one year. And we were playing a game in Missouri, and the official was bad. I mean, the man was horrible. I kept yelling at him about his calls, and he finally started to get off the stand, took his whistle off and handed it to me, and he says, "If you think you can do better, get up here and do it." I looked at her, didn't miss a beat. I said, "Marcia, get up there and officiate." She was gonna do it. She put down her clipboard. She was gonna do it, but he thankfully turned around and reclaimed his territory. But I think she said I was the reason, but I didn't really realize she was gonna say that's the reason she went into officiating volleyball. She wanted to improve the skills of officials and to find a way to deal with coaches like me. Well, she did. She now has 6 conferences that she assigns and evaluates officials. She was recently inducted into the Kansas Collegiate Officials Hall of Fame, and she has made it a livelihood out of officiating volleyball. So, Marcia, I think I should get a cut in your pay or something like that. My family is here today. My husband, Merle, our 2 sons, Shane and his wife, Amy, my son, Kevin, and his wife, Ashley, my sister from North Carolina, Lois Nixon, and my cousin from Alabama, Cheryl Sobel. And over here in this corner, I have some former players. And some of my players from '69, Retha Stuckey started with me, Debbie Jones, Alana Ferris. We all started the program in 1969. I want to thank you guys for this honor. I am here today accepting this award, but I wouldn't do it without my teammates over there, without the officials, the coaches. Mrs. Bear is here, Mrs. Fife was our coaches. They worked for nothing. They got paid nothing. And indeed, the university for starting women's sports in the modern era. A little background on me. I grew up, as Marcia said, on a family farm outside of Mays, Kansas. My parents worked hard, and they taught us to work hard. That's where I learned how to work hard. There was a time for play. It was always after the work was done. My brother loved running and dabbled in several sports. My sister was more into studying than I was. She didn't want to come out to play. God blessed me with great hand-eye coordination and athletic talent. At my 7th birthday, my aunt from California got me a football helmet, and shoulder pads. I think my family knew by that time I was going to do something in sports, but they had no clue the millions of miles that they were going to drive to watch me play whatever I happened to be playing at the time. I realize now how important that support was. My parents were always there. It was just, I just knew they were going to be there, if at all possible. Unless my dad was cutting weed or shearing sheep or doing something like that. He was going to be there. Also within a mile of our farm were 9 neighborhood boys. So I had 1 sister who's older than me, and then 9 boys, and me. So guess what we did? We met in our yard, played football, basketball, baseball, whatever we did after the chores were done. And we even built a high jump pit and a pole vaulting pit in our yard. We had the biggest yard, so they all came to play. I started playing baseball when I was 8 years old on a boys' team in Mays. And then at age 10, they said I was a girl, and I couldn't play on the boys' baseball team. It was too dangerous for a girl to play. I said, okay. So I started playing softball, fast pitch softball, shortstop on a women's team. Here I was, 10 years old, playing on a women's team in Goddard, Kansas. I played fast pitch for about 30 years, traveled all around the United States. We were ranked 8th and 12th was the highest we were ranked out of Wichita, Kansas. Everybody thought Wichita couldn't play fast pitch softball, but we were good. When I went to Mays, I played 6-on-6, the old girls' rules, basketball, because they didn't have anything else. On Saturdays, we had volleyball play days, so we just played a little tournament with Mays, Cheney, Goddard, all those little schools out west of town. And we had track and field days. Shortly after enrolling at WSU, Mrs. Bear called several of us into her office and said, hey, do you guys want to compete in anything? Well, of course, all of us said, of course we do. So about 1969, Alana, Deb, and Retha, and I, and 8 or 10 others started playing volleyball, basketball, softball, and field hockey. In 1970, Marcia Alterman joined the crowd along with a couple other people we added, Deb Atkins, Barb Crelly. So we competed when the start of the fight was on for women's equality in college athletics. We competed because we love the sports. We didn't care about what we didn't have. We had an opportunity to do something. One thing we didn't have was equipment. We either provided it ourselves or borrowed it from the physical education department. So we played in the same uniforms for every sport. Alana has kept hers and brought it and loaned it to me today. Here's what we wore. Whoops, excuse me. Here's what we wore. Bought it from the WSU bookstore. They ironed our numbers on the back for us, so we each had to pick our own number that was legal in all sports, which was a challenge, because there's different rules for everything. Anyway, the next big thing that the university did for us was to give us meal money. When we would travel, they would give us an envelope like this with our name on it. And inside was 5 quarters. Every time we traveled, we would get 5 quarters to eat on. We had to buy our own shorts, black shorts, so we all had black shorts for the same uniform. Had to buy socks, shoes, cleats, gloves, bats, balls, whatever we needed. We drove our own cars, bought our own gas to get to events. We didn't have training room or trainers, so one year, I think it was our junior year, Retha and I took a psychology class across campus from Henry and Jim. Practice was always at 2:30. This was only offered Monday, Wednesday, and Friday, 1:30 to 2:30. So we were always late to class. So in order to save time, we sat in the back row of the auditorium and taped our own ankles. We'd tear the tape really quietly so the professor wouldn't hear it, but we taped our ankles so we could run to practice and get there just a little bit late, and not a whole lot. I can't believe the man didn't ever hear us up there. If he did, he never said a word to us about it. It was no surprise field hockey was not a sport at Mays High School. I had never seen a game until I played in one. I was in a physical education skills class, and Miss Slingelin was my coach for field hockey volleyball. After a couple of days, she says, why don't you come out for the field hockey team? I'm going, you gotta be kidding me. I can't do anything with this stick. I'm sure it was because I was a little over-aggressive and I could run a lot. It had nothing to do with my skills. I hated that sport because I was horrible at it. Anyway, I went out because they needed players. So anyway, I went out. My most memorable field hockey game was at Emporia State. We were tied for first and we had a playoff game. So we went up to Emporia one Saturday afternoon in October. It was cold and it just started to rain when we got there. We had to play the game because it was the end of the season. So every time you hit the ball, a splash of water would go up in the opponent's face. Or if you tripped or somebody tripped you, you would slide in mud and water for 2 or 3 yards. Well, it was a fun game, but by halftime the temperature was dropping and we were freezing. Remember, we had these on. So we went in the locker room, took all the trash bags out of the cans, cut holes for our heads and our arms, put them on underneath these shirts, and wore trash bags underneath our uniforms because we didn't have sweats. We didn't have warm-ups. So we played it. We must have looked awful. We were warmer and a little bit drier, but we won the game, so isn't that the important thing? One of the craziest things we did was to drive to Lawrence, Kansas in a blizzard in 1970 to watch the national tournament, which is what they had before the NC2A championships. They were hosting the volleyball tournament up there. We had a game scheduled, but it was canceled due to the weather. So 13 of us got in 2 cars. I drove my '57 Chevy, and boy, do I wish I still had that car now. Sold it to Deb for $200. What was I thinking? And Pam Lamborn drove her car. We got to the turnpike in El Dorado. They closed the turnpike behind us. We were the last cars they let on. It took us 8 hours to get to Lawrence on the turnpike. But we were determined to see the National Volleyball Tournament. And what an eye-opener it was. Watching women play at that level, we knew we had a long way to go. But what an experience. It made the drive worth it, and thank God we made it home safely. As Marcia mentioned, I was hired to coach volleyball, basketball, and track. I was also enrolled in a master's degree program and completed it in 1976. As you know, Title IX passed in 1972, and by the time I was hired, women were playing in a quasi-league in the state of Kansas. We played only in the state. We still practiced and played at Henry and Jim the first year, and there were a lot of challenges along the way. Knowing what I now know, I'm sure that my early players that are sitting over there thought my competitive drive was a little extreme, because I do hate to lose. I expected everyone to match my desire to win. I will be the first to admit we had some growing pains as we developed into a team playing at this level. Recruiting was always a challenge. 3 sports, travel time, scouting, evaluation, recruiting rules, and my own academic requirements. Needless to say, time management was an issue for me. We were thrilled when Mrs. Fife convinced the athletic department to move to the Roundhouse, which you guys now know as Koch Arena or Henry Leavitt Arena or whatever name it happens to be right now. But you need holes drilled in the floors to support the nets. Ted Bradenhoff was the athletic director at the time, and Harry Miller was the men's basketball coach. They did not want holes drilled in their basketball court. They argued with us, and they didn't want all the lines. They thought that would be too confusing for the basketball players. They were convinced that they would lose every home game that they played, as if Terry Benton or Preston Carrington would trip over those lines as they dribbled down the floor. They absolutely refused to move the basketball goals because it's too hard to set them up. Take them down, set them up, take them down, set them up, So they didn't. So we just had to work around them. It didn't get better quickly. One day we were practicing volleyball, and Jim Wright, who coached football here from 74 to 78, came to the top of the stairs, stood up there, and he says, "Get off the floor, I need it for the football team." Well, I looked at him and I said, "What?" He says, "Get off the floor." I said, "Why?" He says, "It's raining outside." I said, "Don't you play in the rain?" Pretty sarcastically. He said, "Yes, of course." I said, "Then you ought to practice in the rain." I said, "We'll be off at 5:30. He called me every name you could think of, which I won't repeat right now. He left. He never spoke another word to me while I was there. My best memory of track is Herm Wilson. I had only competed in field events at Mays High School and knew almost nothing about training athletes for running events. So early on, I asked him for some reference materials for running, how to train girls for running. He said, "Oh, I'll help you with that. Don't worry about it." I'm going, I've only got like a month to go before track season starts. I need to know something. I need to be smarter than the athletes. He did more than just help. He wrote workouts for my girls, depending on what events they ran in. I only had 6 girls came out the first year. He wrote workouts for them, or he let them work out with the boys. He was a wonderful person, always, always, always willing to help, and welcomed the girls onto that track with open arms. Had no problem with us being down there. I am forever grateful for him for that transition. Another memory etched in my mind about track is we actually had girls qualify for the AIAW Nationals. We have one of them sitting over there in javelin. Peggy Clark qualified in javelin. I took 2 to Corrales, Oregon, to do the shot put and the half mile. Pam Gray had never flown before, never seen an ocean. So after we got there and the track meet was over, before we came back, I rented a VW Bug and off to the Pacific we went. When we got to the Pacific, her face of awe and joy to see an ocean was amazing. I will never forget that face. She and JD got out. It was raining. They didn't care. They got out and played in the waves, and it was cold up there. Got out and played in the waves, climbed on the rocks. Finally, they came back in, got in the car, because I was in the car. I didn't care. She thanked me a dozen times. She said she never thought she'd get an opportunity like this, but sports gave it to her. She says, this trip was well worth it, even though I didn't do very well. I said, you did just fine. So sometimes it's not the competition that matters, it's what takes place off the field. But from these meager beginnings, driving vans late at night, scraping by on very little money, Wichita State has built a women's program that is strong and something every Shocker should be proud of. In closing, sports have been good to me. They've given me more than I've ever expected. I cherish the countless memories I've had on and off the field with all the friends, teammates, coaches that I've played with. I love sports. I still do. I officiate volleyball now. We played, all of us, not for medals, not for awards. We played because we love the sport. We love the competition. We love the camaraderie. And we had a lot of fun. I'm afraid some of the girls today miss a lot of fun. We had a great time. We were more than teammates. We were and are friends because of the sports we played at Wichita State. I'm especially proud of this recognition that it brings to the era that I played, my coaches, my teammates, and the athletes that I coached. I would not be receiving this award if it weren't for all of them. I accept this award for all of us from that era. Thank you very much.